Hey everyone, so I'm Pete Benora. Nice to be here in real life and to see everyone. And, I'm a principal solutions architect at Amazon Web Services. I've been here for working with Amazon Web Services for the last 6 years, focused on both security and financial services, but also over the years have worked with a number of different customers from retail to healthcare, life sciences, and other customers. So I've been kind of run the gamut and even IoT deployments and those sorts of things and security aspects of those. So, let me know if you have any questions after this, and I'm sure Ron will send out the presentation with my contact info if you have any questions or anything after that. So today we're going to focus on really more of a primer around AWS security and some of the things that we think about as we go into large enterprise customers and help them deploy security. So as you're probably familiar with, what are some of the challenges with security on-prem today? And having the visibility across all of your environments, looking at the ways that you keep track of those things, whether it be from the audit and compliance perspective, or even just everyday, patching and management of those systems. Definitely one of the challenges, getting the visibility of those things. And then also the automation around that. So when you look into, automation of processes, whether it be patch management or even auditing and trying to cut and paste things into different systems and see, okay, what does this configuration look like, all those things. Those are definitely some of the challenges that we see customers on-prem. So what we want you to do is move fast and stay secure versus the binary, one or the other, right? So instead of slowing down to account for all those slow human processes you have to do and managing those configurations manually, being able to now in a cloud environment automate those processes and have that full visibility as you do within a cloud environment. So you can see all the API calls that were made when a system was configured. You can go and see what the patch level is, the vulnerabilities are in your systems, using tools and capabilities that are just native to the platform. So one local customer, an example that I wanted to bring up was Fidelity. They've been moving to AWS for the last number of years due to complete migrations in 2022. We've worked with them on building out their all detective controls, preventive controls, mapping out those controls. So like one thing I mentioned is like as you've got your controls frameworks already set up, right, within your existing environments, whether those be more healthcare related like HIPAA HITRUST or PCI, or maybe you're following a NIST framework. You don't have to like reinvent the wheel of what you have for those control frameworks. It's more about we go through the process with our customers of what those mappings look like into AWS, so you can then benefit from the automation of that, right? So you don't throw away all your existing things in terms of those processes and control frameworks, but you can then, as you're going into a cloud environment, look at how I implement those potentially in a different way that is more automated. And then Goldman Sachs, another customer that's been moving to AWS. What I like about this example, so we, as you'll notice, we're working with AWS as you work with us. 90-95% of what we build is based on what our customers tell us they want. We work backwards from our customers to build those roadmaps. So like here's an example where if you work with us, you will be speaking to service teams, and so those teams are actually building these services. And in this case, Goldman Sachs came to us with a requirement for bringing their own keys for encryption and key management. And so we had a key management service as a managed and audit, highly managed audit service that you could use. They really wanted to bring their own keys from their centralized PKI environment. And so we basically built this capability out for them to meet their compliance needs, to be able to bring your own keys, generate them in on-prem environment or your own HSMs, and then bring them directly into a key management system. And we took that a step further and actually built out an HSM hardware security module environment where you can then import those keys and have FIPS 140 level 3 in that environment. So something, just an example that we've done to work with customers to really build out what they're looking for and give them their level of compliance requirements. And then locally I've worked with one large financial wealth management company. They have over $1 trillion in assets under management. Presented our reInvent conference a couple years back, but completely migrated all of their systems to AWS at this point, and closed their data centers, met all the compliance requirements. But it was a lot of different aspects and challenges, right? Things that we had to work with was like older systems that had millions of lines of code in legacy databases, and how would you think about moving those, or Portfolio management, accounting systems that were highly regulated, running in memory, and how do we think about, running those on AWS and the resiliency and availability that they need. So talking about resiliency, I don't know if you're all familiar with what this looks like. When you go into AWS, you have a lot of options in terms of where you want to deploy, right? You pick a region, which is, within it has these availability zones that are clusters of data centers. They're highly redundant. Diverse power, separate floodplains, and we make sure that those environments, diverse networking, that they're far enough apart that you have all the diversity that you need, but close enough together that you have like single-digit millisecond latency. So you can actually do your database replications. You can do load balancing across them, have the availability across those with redundancy, and then also you can choose to potentially replicate to another region. Say maybe it's Virginia and Ohio or West Coast, and you can choose to replicate to another region for your disaster recovery as well. So give you a lot of options for that around resiliency. And within these data centers and within these availability zones, there's obviously clusters of different data centers. You have choice of what servers you want to use within those and different instance families and different instance types. And then also, lately in terms of resiliency, things like ransomware, right? So thinking about how you're going to take your existing data center environments, if you have them in the cloud, and replicate those to other regions in more of a secure vaulted environment where you can then recover those. And so you could, potentially you could have obviously other on-prem data centers where you could do that as well. But one of the advantages of being an AWS is the capability to have the automation around rebuilding those environments, reconstituting them as needed, and having automatic replication with multiple copies of that data. So that it is available when it's needed, and then processes around how you move that data and how you manage it. So those are some of the advantages of the resiliency there. And then a big piece of also moving to AWS is inheriting the compliance, attestations and certifications that we've already gone through as part of your implementation, right? So whether it be, the ISO 27001, 27017, 18, or HIPAA HITRUST if you're in healthcare, PCI if you're retail or credit card processing. By deploying on AWS, you inherit these controls that have already been attested to and audited, and you have access to those as well to be able to review. So you're building your workload on top of those. There's in the thousands of controls you no longer have to worry about. Whether it be your physical controls and managing the data center, might be hypervisor controls that you don't only have to manage, right? And all those things are really part of what you get is just moving to AWS. So in terms of like being able to scale, having that visibility we talked about, we don't move your data. Basically, you decide where you want that data to reside. If you have data residency requirements, if you put it in, Northern Virginia, or you put it in Dublin, it's going to stay, where it is in terms of the data residency. They give you fine-grained access controls and identity access management. So within those environments, you can basically choose down to the most granular level who has access to what, and enabling least privilege. So you can say, I want Joe, who's a DBA, to have access from 9 to 5 Monday through Friday on these systems. You can get that down to that level of granularity. Or maybe it's an offshore team that only has access to these environments, on off hours, whenever it might be, and only specific environments. So you can get down to that level of granularity. Being able to automate controls as well. So, we have detective controls, be able to detect those things that may come up in incident response, and be able to respond to those automatically as part of the system, right? So if you detect, something gets spun up that it shouldn't, maybe it's a database that doesn't have appropriate tagging, or they write encryption. And these are part of your control framework, and you might get, today you might get a notification of that in your on-prem, you might not, but within the system, you can basically create a process that will remediate those issues as they immediately as the preventive control as well. So either you can control them with identity access management to say they shouldn't be allowed, but also have other layers of controls on top of that to be able to then maybe remediate that issue as well. So up-leveling your overall security. We believe that moving to AWS, you can be more secure than you would be, on-prem environment. We have to be, right? So things like encryption everywhere. And this is something I talk to CISOs and security teams about all the time. They ask me, where should I be enabling encryption? How should I be enabling it? And we give you the tools to be able to enable it everywhere. There's native encryption in motion, whether it be TLS, between data centers or within virtual private cloud. So if you pick, our Nitro-based instances, you have that kind of default security for that. You can also enable your own TLS using Certificate Manager for encryption motion, and then encryption everywhere at rest as well and in storage. So using the KMS, key management system, we make it incredibly easy to turn it on across the services, whether you're creating a new virtual machine, you're spinning up a database or a database service, whether it be machine learning type services in SageMaker, really easy to have that as part of your deployment process. So I mentioned, having an automated deployment process, you can bake that into that automation as well to say that all those things should be encrypted as they're spun up. And if they're not, either remediate that or send me an alert using that capability. And then, making sure that you enable compliant workloads on top of AWS. So, putting it all in codified form, right? So like infrastructure as code is one of the pieces that you get into in building out the pipelines for deployment. So within that infrastructure as code, you're going to say, all these different parts of your compliance are going to be part of that infrastructure as code, but then you can also verify that. We have a tool that can actually go through and make sure that those meet your policy requirements as they're being deployed, right? As they're in the pipeline to be deployed, having the security baked into that deployment pipeline and making sure that it meets those requirements and those controls right out of the gate without having developers kind of just deploying with whatever they want, without meeting those controls. So I've already talked about some of those things like automating that response, but there's a tool we have called GuardDuty is one example. And that tool and that service will actually look for anomalies that are happening. Like if I deploy APIs, outside of hours, I would typically do that. If I deploy services, if there's anomalous network activity, it will scan all the networking activity that's happening, anomalous DNS traffic, all those kinds of things will go against threat networks as well and check against those and make sure that, it's kind of like your intrusion prevention, intrusion detection, but with machine learning built into it as well. So you can then automate the responses to those things. So like if there's a machine, say there's a virtual machine in your environment that is anomalous traffic, maybe it's, doing a brute force attack on something else in your environment, like what is this, action that's happening, you can then automate the process to isolate that service and that server, maybe take an in-memory snapshot and then bring that into an environment where security team can then run their tools to incident response. Or maybe that could be also automated as well, the incident response process and running those tools against the instances, sending a report to your security team. But this is what you get into when you're in an environment where you have all these things available in tools and APIs to be able to either build them, or we give you services to just run those, right? Instead of having to kind of piece together, a variety of all these different tools that you kind of put together that may or may not have the APIs you need to build this kind of consolidated system. So we have, probably over 200 services in general, and we have many security services. This can look very daunting, I would say, you start to look at what are all these tools and where am I going to use what. But, there is definitely some core patterns that you need to consider as opposed to like looking at all the services, like things that that are core to securing the environments you'll need to learn. Like IAM is one example, identity access management system, which controls like, who authenticates the system and then what they have access to. And there's policies associated with that for kind of each service you would set up to say, like I mentioned, this person should have access, so this team should have access, to these specific services that are part of what their team manages, and then from this time to that time. Or maybe they don't have access at all and it's really part of the pipeline that deploys it has access. But that's like one kind of key tool, a foundational tool that you'll, you would set up. Things like, single sign-on, so giving you an easy way to give access across all of your AWS environments using even your existing single sign-on tools as well, right? So we can integrate with like Okta or Active Directory Federation services, ping identity, all these things can be used to then just basically authenticate, federate into SSO, and then give you access to AWS resources that you need. Under Detective Controls, Security Hub gives you a kind of single pane of glass, centralized view over your security. You can set it up to look at compliance requirements. Maybe it's like looking at your PCI view of your environment and how that maps to those PCI controls that we see customers that require. Looking across, it kind of ties together a lot of the other tools to give you visibility, or I mentioned like guard duty and that detection process, like having one place to view that and then remediate that as well. CloudTrail is an audit trail of all of your API calls that are made in your environment that are calls to AWS services. So like you can find out who, what, where, when, called these services, and have that trail of those service calls. And then, infrastructure protection, like your virtual private cloud is really the core of where you carve out your piece of the cloud to be able to deploy services into. And that can be, that's an isolated environment from other VPCs and other accounts. So there you have, a separate environment of VPC and an account for your development, your staging, your production. All those things might have different processes and controls to how they're deployed, how you deploy to them, that sort of thing. I mentioned already the key management service is a really core service because that's where all of your keys for encryption would reside for things like encryption of storage volumes or within services. That's a way to have a highly audited, managed environment for encryption. But you can also deploy hardware security modules if that's part of your requirements as well. Incident response, so being able to have backups in the case of, we talked about ransomware, right? So having an automated process for pushing all those backups to another region and have them available in case you need to do an automated recovery of those. Detective, to be able to go in and actually do more deep dives into the services to see, and tie together the services to see where the incident might have started and track it all the way through. And then on the compliance side, audit manager. So, the whole process around audit, whatever frame you could have, is going to be very much a manual process today. Auditors are having to reach out to all these teams and get configurations and screenshots and all these things. Audit manager automates most of that. So like you can pick your frameworks and create custom frameworks based on whatever you might have today in place. If you follow NIST or you follow PCI, you can create combinations of those frameworks that your auditors can use to then automatically get those configurations because they're all available and you have that visibility. They're part of the AWS configuration, AWS config, part of CloudTrail. They're available in the environment. So what that can do is then pull those things back and put them into the framework so that your auditors can easily kind of access those and have the actual evidence of that's the actual configuration in place. And then if they want to go do more research, they can go into the service and see what the configuration is, but this will pull those things together for them. One other thing on audit and compliance I should mention is, I didn't mention it, so AWS Artifact is where you can go into on any of your accounts and see, I mentioned all of the different certifications, attestations, and all that stuff, right? Those things you inherit when you move to AWS as part of your compliance. Like you can go into Artifact and pull any of those reports and actually, see what those are, be able to give those to your auditors and, meet your compliance needs that as part of your compliance needs. So partner solutions, there are in the thousands of partners we work with, right? And a lot of the ones that you're already using today are, we're working closely with integrating with those into the AWS environment. So try to give you a similar experience. I mentioned being able to use APIs and tie those all together inside of a cloud environment. Well, if you're already using Palo Alto firewalls, as an example, you would still use like our security group capabilities for firewalling, but you can also use Palo Alto, and we have, just as an example, announced like an integration with our firewall manager into Palo Alto to make it much more seamless to be able to use. So you can bring a lot of the existing tools. What we would usually do is go through that process of looking at your control framework and your controls and mapping those into what would make sense in AWS, right? So do you want to use a native capability, or do you want to use something that, that you're already using on-prem, and what are the benefits and the drawbacks of that? I mentioned Okta and Ping and those solutions for login. Like we work with all those solutions. I have many customers using those as well, and it ties in AWS SSO. Bridgecrew and Qualys, Tenable, these are all like your vulnerability management. Bridgecrew also does a lot of the, in your pipeline as you're deploying in a CI/CD pipeline. It can also look at those configurations and making sure that they're meeting your compliance. HashiCorp, a lot of customers that use HashiCorp Vault for storing secrets, things like that. And then on the logging side, many customers are using Splunk and Sumo Logic and others for centralizing all their logging and having the security incident event management system tie into AWS. And then consulting partners, I won't get too deep into these, but pretty much all the partners that you're working with, we're working with as well, and ensuring that they're meeting our standards for being a partner that you want to deploy security capabilities with. We have those processes they go through for getting certified as partners, and we have partner managers that manage that relationship as well at AWS. So one key component of deploying in AWS and really in any provider is like the concept of the shared responsibility model. So understanding what that means is really important, in that, what is the security in the cloud, which is something that's your responsibility, versus security of the cloud, which is our responsibility in managing, the infrastructure and all the aspects of that. And that really, it moves based on the service you choose. So if you just choose to, this is like what you'd manage on-prem, right? It's everything from, the data center, secure physical security, all the way up through how I'm going to do encryption or how customers access data, what the authentication authorization is. All those things are your responsibility. As you use cloud services, its most basic form, maybe you're deploying virtual machines, right? So now all the data center physical access controls, all the networking between the data centers, all that is our responsibility. Everything up through the hypervisor itself is our responsibility. But now as you set those machines up, now maybe it's a Linux or Windows machine, you still have responsibility for managing those machines. So the patching of those machines, as the operating system piece of it, the applications get installed on those, the firewall configurations and rules, those are all part of still your responsibility. As you look at higher level services, maybe it's a relational database service, right? So I'm going to look at deploying Postgres on RDS or whatever database. Pretty much we support all the major flavors of databases as managed services. In those cases, now we take on the responsibility of managing the operating system, and a lot of the database capability, like say the patching of the databases, the backup process of the databases. You still configure it and say, yes, I want to do backups in this time, but you no longer have to worry about all the setup of those backups, or the failover process. How does that database fail over to another database? You're not configuring all those things. You are still configuring as a DBA, like, okay, what's the indexes on the database? Who has access to this table? Those are still your responsibilities, but it shifts upward. And then you get into the services like a storage service like S3, which is an object storage, or higher level AI machine learning services. Like we have, a service called Rekognition that will recognize like faces and objects and things like that. Now that shifted all the way up to just the application itself, right? You're just setting up, making an API call, you're sending, a picture of something and getting back a response. And, from our machine learning service, and you're no longer managing the servers under it, the capacity of those servers, all those kinds of things are no longer things you have to worry about. So that's kind of the difference. We have all those services where your responsibility, shifts up or down, what things you have to manage on that process. And we're more and more customers adopting those higher level services because they don't really want to manage servers anymore, right? Even like we mentioned containers and serverless. Maybe your developer just wants to deploy a function, which is just a snippet of code that runs, and they don't have to worry about necessarily scaling that function up and down, or managing all the processes in between that. They just want to deploy their functions, have those run as microservices, have the availability already tied into load balancing globally or whatever it is, and not have to manage all those things. So that's where really we see a lot more customers headed towards. It started off with virtual machines and then containers, and now it's serverless and then higher level services as well, and not having to to worry about all the management in between. So some next steps and things, as you guys lead today, I'd say if you're interested in getting educated, we do have a site, aws.training, which has a ton of information, virtual labs that are free that you can go through, security training as well. You can go through, if you have, what we see customers typically do is like set up programs as they're starting to do large scale migrations, so that all their their teams start to get up to speed, but also have goals around it. So maybe a goal is that they're going to get cloud practitioner certified, or solutions architect certified, and then eventually move to being a security specialist certified. But there's some of these things are like courses, AWS fundamentals, architecting in AWS. These are courses we also offer. But you're starting to think about how that you're going to get your teams up to speed with these things and bring them forward, because that's really going to be your engine for making this happen. We have another framework called Well Architected. So as you do look at deploying on AWS, it was originally a framework that was just documents, right? That showed you, okay, these are the best practices and things to think about around security and availability and performance and cost and all these things. We've actually made it into a tool now that you can use inside of any AWS account. You can then use to take new architectures and new applications through this process and make sure that you're meeting all of the best practices around these different areas. So security is one of the key pillars of that, and definitely recommend making that as part of your process. A lot of enterprise architecture teams will use that as well, and architecture review boards, and they'll like, okay, let me see your well architected report. And it's something you can iterate on as well. So you do a first version, you go through your initial architecture, and then as you come up with areas of improvement, you can then iterate on that report and have those things documented as you're moving forward. And then lastly, looking at some of the other resources, the AWS Artifact tool, which I mentioned, has all the compliance reports, Compliance Center, and security documentation, just so you guys all have the links to these things. You can get to them if you are interested in learning more about any of these different services. That's all I have.